I have a love-hate relationship with Age of Sigmar's Stormcast Eternals. On the one hand, they're noble warriors posed in really heroic stances, and on the other hand, they're noble warriors posed in really heroic stances, a fundamentally different animal than the grim gothic of 40k or the more historical mud and dirt of Warhammer Fantasy. Right now, Stormcast have three aesthetic threads that compose their armor: medieval European, Greek or Roman, and generic fantasy. One of these, the medieval-esque legs, I like, while the other two I don't. The Roman skirt and then metal muscles of the abs, pecs, and calves, and the generic fantasy of the pauldrons and chunky arms. In this kit bash, I'm going to leave the legs relatively untouched, while trying to replace or convert the above-the-waist elements to match their medieval aesthetic. For my first attempt at medievalizing a Stormcast, I started by attempting to splice this putrid Blight King chestplate to a Liberator. Blight Kings are the GW models with the plainest medieval European armor, are the correct scale, and I also dig their pitted and rusted aesthetic. To get it to fit on the Stormcast though, I had to cut away his golden abs until his front was flat. I also carved off the Roman skirt portions, which are probably my least favorite element of the Stormcast aesthetic. It leaves a huge blank spot, but I figured I could cover it later with ragged green stuff cloth or chainmail. With his front flattened, I dry fitted the Blight King torso over it. The fit was good, but the armor was a little taller than the Stormcast's, so I went in and snipped off the Stormcast's waist so legs and torso were separated. While the legs were detached, I carved off the armor diaper the Stormcast usually wears, again planning to just replace it later with chainmail or cloth. I mixed up green stuff and used a glob of it to attach the Blight King armor to the Stormcast legs. You can see that doing so makes my Stormcast taller than a normal one, but I'm actually okay with that because one of the things that bugs me about Stormcast is how squat and short their torsos are. My second most hated part of the Stormcast are their pauldrons, so I snipped those off and scraped the arms clean. Once they were gone, I used green stuff to attach the back and arms to the Blight King torso. What I realized looking at what I had so far was that the original Stormcast arms weren't going to work. The shoulders were now too narrow, so I decided to simply discard them and the back of the Stormcast. I didn't have the matching back of the Blight King torso, so I simply decided to use the Stormcast shield as a replacement to hide all the green stuff and lack of body. I didn't attach it just yet though because I wasn't sure how it would sit once his arms were attached. For said arms, I decided on the Blight King ones. The axe to this one is a bit too fireman-esque to me, so I snipped it off at the wrist and replaced it with this war pick. For the other arm, I used the original Stormcast upper arm, layered on a Blight King pauldron, used a Blight King forearm, and switched the weapon to an axe. Though lacking a head, my blighted Stormcast was basically done, and I didn't really like it that much. The pose is stiff and awkward, and essentially all I'd done was transplant a Blight King torso onto Stormcast legs. Not a bad experiment, but not quite what I was looking for. For my second attempt at grounding a Stormcast, I decided to try a more sculpting-centered approach. I started by cutting into the Stormcast just as I had with the first, detaching the torso from the legs, carving off the Roman skirt, golden abs, and pauldrons. This time, I also sliced off the edges of the forearm bracers so they would be a little slimmer and less clunky and exaggerated. I used green stuff to reattach the torso to the legs, and then started sculpting my Stormcast new pauldrons. I don't have a lot of skill sculpting, so I decided to start off simply by recreating the old pauldrons, except this time adding a lip to give them a more severe look. This turned out well, so I decided to take it a step further by cutting off more of the original pauldrons and sculpting in 2 more armor plates below the first. High off my sculpting successes, I layered green stuff onto the legs of the Stormcast and blank spaces left by cutting off the Roman skirt. Once the green stuff was even, I started sculpting in chainmail. This did not work great. It doesn't look terrible, but it doesn't really look like chainmail either, more like quilted armor. I stripped it off and decided to focus instead on forging my Stormcast a breastplate. My plan was to base it off a standard knight breastplate where there's a ridge running up the middle and a collar at the top. This, like the chainmail, did not turn out well, and I cut much of it off. Instead of making another attempt to sculpt chainmail, I simply created a cast of the chainmail from the putrid Blight King kit and made a combined milliput and green stuff copy. This worked much better than my sculpting attempts, and I glued it in place. Another aspect of the original Stormcast that makes it look very Bronze Age Greek to me are the rounded calves of the legs. Since I was already working on his bottom half, I went in and shaved them down to be less prominent. The legs worked out, I took another swing at the torso. This time, I sliced off the back collar of the Stormcast and glued it to the front, which worked really well. I then took a ball of mixed milliput and green stuff and started sculpting it into a belly plate. This kind of upward triangular plate is really common in medieval armor, and I figured it would be easier than sculpting an entire breastplate. I've tried to sculpt both green stuff and milliput separately, but this was my first time using a 50-50 combination of the two, and it made the process so much easier. It's a lot easier to manipulate than green stuff, but also sticks together more than milliput, meaning I could get some pretty fine detail. I decided to push my luck and try adding some rondels to the Stormcast chest. This worked okay, but not great. What did work better was sculpting in hip plates to fall from the breastplate in the way medieval armor generally does. Another aesthetic of medieval armor is pointed knees and elbow plates, so I used the same green stuff and milliput combination to sculpt points to his knees. For his head, I first tried this Stormcast, but it kind of undid all the work I'd done by making him look more high fantasy-esque all over again. I decided to replace it with the Space Marine helmet whose techie bits I filed off. It's not perfect, but reads passably medieval. While I was much happier with my second Stormcast than my first, I wanted to see if there was a way of achieving the same quality with less sculpting. In my Iron Patriarch Homebrew Space Marine chapter, I pretty successfully spliced a Tartarus Terminator chestplate with that of a Primaris. And for this third Stormcast, I decided to take the same approach. I started by snipping off the bottom half of the Tartarus torso to leave an armored collar. The original Stormcast torso I cut flat so that the Tartarus collar could be glued atop it. Before I attached it to the Stormcast body, I cut off the back of the Stormcast so it was raised to match the collar's height. More green stuff was then added to hold the whole body together. Just as I had with the last Stormcast, I glued a chainmail copy to the blank spot left in front of the legs. I also glued in place a pair of armor plates I copied from a Chaos Warrior. I used a milliput and green stuff mix to fill out the gaps between the Tartarus collar and the original Stormcast, and smooth the whole thing to look like one piece. Instead of sculpting a belt, I simply used this length of chain to wrap around his waist and glue in place. Over it, on the front, I sculpted a bottom flare to his breastplate. I also sculpted a pair of pauldrons on my Stormcast, though this time I went with a simpler design than I had on my previous one. While I'd left the hammer in place for that one, for this Stormcast I decided to replace his weapon with a mace from a Black Orc. I snipped the head of the mace from the haft, then glued it to the haft of the original. To make it sturdier, I should have pinned it, but pinning handles that are this thin is an enormous pain. To hide the pristine design of the axe wrappings, I applied a thin layer of green stuff. Finally, I glued in place a Space Marine head. The few cybernetic portions to it I scraped off before doing so, and with it attached, it gave my Stormcast a really strong warrior priest aesthetic. And with that, my Stormcasts were ready to storm the field. The third warrior priest one I think is the one that looks the best. The extensively sculpted one the second best, and the Blight King one the third. Really though, they were all successful to an extent. This was a more experimental video than my norm. Usually I'm focused on trying to make a great model from start to finish, while for this one I mostly wanted to explore a few different avenues of how to ground and medievalize Stormcast. It was definitely useful in that way, and I've got some more ambitious Stormcast conversions on the way. If you'd like to see those when they're posted, then subscribe to this channel and like this video. I also have a Patreon you can contribute to, and as always, thanks for watching.